This video was brought to you by Ground News. For the past few years, China has been struggling with a slow-burning but apparently irreparable economic crisis. What began as a property crisis centred around property behemoth Evergrande has since spiralled out into a wider crisis affecting local governments, consumer confidence and GDP growth generally. While China's economic woes don't dominate the headlines like they did back during the Evergrande crisis, the crisis has been quietly getting worse recently, much to the CCP's disappointment. Last week, the Financial Times reported that a record number of Chinese citizens and companies had declared bankruptcy this year. And last week, one of the big credit rating agencies, Moody's, downgraded China's credit outlook to negative, citing faltering GDP growth and the ongoing property crisis. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at China's ongoing economic crisis, the recent bad news, and how all this relates to the wider problem of excessive Chinese debt. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To understand this story, you need to know a bit about China's debt problem. At first glance, China doesn't look like it has a debt problem at all. After all, according to the IMF, China's central government debt to GDP stands at just 77%, below every G7 country except Germany. But this obscures the extent of China's debt crisis for two reasons. First, unlike in other countries, in China, the state doesn't just borrow via the central government, but also indirectly via state-owned banks, funds, and local governments. If you include these, China's debt to GDP ratio suddenly ends up at about 120%, roughly the same as the US. Second, on top of this public sector borrowing, the private sector in China also has a lot of debt, especially by developing economy standards. While the data differs a bit depending on which source you use, Reuters' analysis in 2014 found that private debt in China, expressed as a percentage of GDP, overtook the G7 in about 2013. All in all, China's total debt, including both public and private borrowing, currently stands at a bit over 280% of GDP, according to Bloomberg analysis from earlier this year. This would suggest that China's debt ratio is far higher than that of basically any country with a similar GDP per capita. Analysis done by the Financial Times in 2018 found that, while China had a similar total debt to GDP ratio to other developing economies in the early 2000s, it's since diverged, and in 2018 it was already roughly double that of other developing economies. So why is this? Why is Chinese debt so high? Well, while a total explanation is probably beyond the scope of a TLDR video, and economists are still arguing over the precise causes, data suggests the overall increase in China's debt ratio has mostly been driven by three things: corporate debt, local government debt, and household debt. Corporate debt is so high mainly because Chinese companies have taken out copious amounts of cash in an attempt to capitalize on China's unprecedented and rapid economic growth. Property developers are the best examples here. They've borrowed lots of money on the assumption that Chinese property prices, especially in urban areas, would continue to rise at the rate they did in the 90s and 2000s, which is why the recent slowdown in house price growth has proven so problematic. Another big contributor to the increase in total debt are local governments and local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, which are basically shell companies created to allow local governments to borrow money against the value of the land they own. The total value of local government debt has tripled from about 25% of GDP in 2012 to about 75% in the past decade or so. This is largely because, as we've detailed in other videos, unlike other countries which just measure GDP at the end of the year, in China the central government actively sets GDP targets for local governments at the beginning of the year. Usually the CCP sets pretty high targets, both to keep unemployment low and impress international markets. Local governments then have to find ways of meeting these targets, and local governments often resort to borrowing lots of money to fund GDP-boosting infrastructure projects. Finally, the rise in household debt, which has gone from about 40% of GDP in 2016 to over 60% today, and has a lot to do with the property crisis. houses are extraordinarily expensive in China, and households have borrowed lots of money via mortgages to get on the property ladder. But their debt problems have become more acute as house price growth has slowed. Anyway, in the last couple of years or so, China's debt crisis has got significantly worse for two reasons. First, conscious of the scale of China's debt crisis, the CCP has been actively trying to deleverage sectors of the Chinese economy, most notably the property sector, which has led to a slew of defaults. Second, the wider slowdown in the Chinese economy has put strain on debtors, and lower GDP figures have also obviously increased China's overall debt-to-GDP ratio. This problem has been exacerbated by an accompanying slowdown in wage growth, which has been particularly acute in certain white-collar sectors, and an uptick in unemployment, especially with urban graduates. Somewhat unsurprisingly, recent data from the Financial Times suggests that defaults have surged to a record high in China in the last year. Over 8.5 million people, representing about 1% of working-age Chinese adults, have declared bankruptcy, up from less than 6 million pre-pandemic. Other data suggests that credit card defaults are up 26% this year, and foreclosures are up nearly a third. So, what happens next? Well, a full-on financial crisis looks unlikely, both because, well, it's been a couple of years of stress and we haven't seen a crash, and because the CCP has pretty tight control over China's banking system. Perhaps the CCP should instead be more concerned about a Japan-style balance sheet recession, which is when, as asset prices fall, households and companies become singularly preoccupied with paying down their debts. While this might make sense on an individual level, for example, if the price of your house goes down steeply, it makes sense to focus on paying off your mortgage to reduce your risk of bankruptcy. If everyone in the economy starts doing this at the same time, then the economy stagnates. This also makes interest rate cuts less effective, because if households and companies are focused on debt minimization instead of profit maximization, then cheaper borrowing rates won't really change anything, because they don't want to borrow more money anyway. The CCP are apparently aware of this risk, which is why they've recently signalled their intention to support distressed sectors with new stimulus, which could help avert a balance sheet recession. But while this might avoid widespread defaults, new stimulus maintains the high debt burden and risks actually exacerbating the debt crisis. Just consider the property sector, for instance. New stimulus will prevent big developers from going bust, but it won't actually make those businesses profitable, and it could provide more fuel for China's speculative real estate bubble. If you do want to follow what happens next in this story, you should check out our sponsor Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For example, here's a story relevant to this video: the changing relationship between the US and China. Right away, you can see that the story had 19 outlets reporting on it. 19% lean left, while 38% lean right. Every story also comes with a detailed view of the bias distribution, factuality scores, and even specific ownership information. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to get a more detailed understanding of how reporting might change based on political bias. But my favourite part has to be their new Bias Insights feature, which highlights specific differences in left-leaning and right-leaning reporting. They even have complete timelines for some of the more complicated issues going on. Their coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict breaks down the major stories as they emerge, and allows you to track the political bias in real time. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. In fact, if you subscribe today, you'll get 30% off their Vantage plan. That's under $6 a month for unlimited access to every incredible Ground News feature. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.